Welcome to Teacher Talks. I'm Maria Keffler.
And I'm Erin Brewer. And what are we talking about today, Maria?
Today we're going to talk about trauma and how trauma can lead a child to adopt a transgender identity. And this is something that you know quite a bit about.
And it really makes sense when you think about trauma. A lot of times we hear about people who have endured serious trauma developing PTSD and oftentimes developing something called a dissociative process. And what this means is that they sort of have the capability to separate from who they are and either sort of float out in space so that they don't have to endure the trauma or even to develop a new persona. And this is something that is very well documented. It's a wonderful coping mechanism that we have in order to deal with horrific trauma. But at the same time, it can lead to a transgender identity, because once somebody has dissociated like that, it becomes easier and easier to dissociate in the future. And so basically, a transgender identity at its heart is somebody rejecting who they are, killing off the person that they were and becoming a new person and wanting the rest of the world to acknowledge them as a new person. So it really makes sense that trauma can drive this transgender identity.
It seems like adopting a transgender identity really is a dissociative process. It really sort of embodies the dissociative disorder. And by encouraging kids to do this, especially kids who've had trauma, whether that's sexual trauma, other kinds of abuse, the death of somebody that they cared about, being rejected, there's any number of kinds of trauma that can feed into this. But by encouraging kids to adopt a transgender identity in order to cope with trauma, we're really telling them to dissociate from themselves rather than dealing with the traumatic event.
And one of the things that's really disconcerting about this is that if a child's transgender identity is embraced, and if indeed the root of that dissociation is trauma, it means that the child is not going to get help to process that trauma. Instead, they're going to basically be told that they're so flawed, they're so damaged, that that self-shame and self-hatred that they have is so profound that they cannot recover from it unless they become another person. That's not a message we should ever give to a child.
And we hear that from detransitioners, from people who thought they were transgender and then they have come out of it and accepted their birth sex. So many of these detransitioners are saying, once I announced a transgender identity, nothing else about me was attended to. Even kids who and young adults who had been in therapy for trauma, for autism, for whether that's depression or anxiety, even if they were in therapy for those issues, once they announced a transgender identity, the therapist no longer attended to any of those other issues. That's unethical, that's irresponsible, and that's doing nothing to help the child.
And it's really sad, especially in the case of sexual assault, because I've talked to detransitioners who have endured terrible sexual assaults, and a lot of that anger just gets focused on their genitals and their sexed body because that's what was violated. And to think that transitioning and encouraging that continued self-harming behavior, continue to damage that body that's already been violated, just to me is such a disservice to that child. And it's such a disservice to our society in general to accept the concept that somebody who has such difficult feelings about who they are and their body as a result of an assault or other trauma, that we should go ahead and encourage them to basically reject that child who was so desperately hurt and become a different child. There is nothing authentic about that. In fact, it's the antithesis of authenticity to suggest that they should become a different person rather than to heal that child that so desperately needs our help to accept who they are and to process what they went through.